Let me give you a model, a takeaway, a soundbite to discuss brains-based approach. The reason the Manhattan Project, which built the first 3 atomic bombs, succeeded was because of E equals MC squared. What is missing today in the debate over strategy and national security is the equivalent of E equals MC squared. I don't want to sound terribly vain to say that I have the suggestion, but I think a brains-based approach really fulfills some of the answers of what we need. And to that I have added, and what the British Army can do in implementing one. So the last third of my brief remarks will be focused on specific things that the Army, I hope, will be able to undertake. Now, I realize that anybody who is sane, sober, or sensible would not foreclose the use of brains or intellect in coping with the most difficult problems we face, especially regarding security, prosperity, and stability. But why do we not always use those brains? Part of the answers rest that political pressures, ideological convictions, bureaucratic and narrow interests, using money as a palliative, or just intellectual laziness often prevent the full use of brains in that approach. Now, what do I mean by a brains-based approach? And like Gall, it's divided in 3 parts. First, it must be based on knowledge to facilitate a greater understanding of all aspects of the problems we wish to seek, what the alternatives are, what the assumptions are, and what the consequences are. It has to be extremely well informed, and you've heard a lot of discussion today about how do we do that. I will add to that shortly. Second, the approach must have a 21st century mindset. Too often, we are still based in the 20th century, and we are relying on the view of a world that is still largely Westphalian, which means it is state-based. But what has happened, and the driving factor here, is the empowerment by the diffusion of power and globalization of individuals from bin Laden to the leader of the caliphate, transnational groups from the EU to the UN to different trade pacts, and of course to non-state groups such as Al-Qaeda and of course the Islamic State that have really succeeded in some cases superseding or surpassing the nation-state system. We have to understand if we don't have the right mindset, we're not going to come up with the right strategies. And thirdly, the aim of this must be affecting, influencing, and even controlling the will and perception of the other, using our brains to outthink their brains. It's something we talk about, but we don't often do it. Now, signs of the assault on the Westphalian system are found in largely invisible and accompanying overarching realities that have been largely dismissed or ignored. The first is that the best and most powerful armies, navies, and air forces in the world cannot defeat an enemy who lacks them, or in the Clausewitzian sense is using other means. Second, while we use the terms asymmetric and hybrid promiscuously, the fact of the matter is that we are getting killed in cost exchange ratios by the other side, particularly in winning the political and propaganda wars. And third, and most importantly, the strategic linkages that are part of this new world that really join virtually all parts of the world together are the centroid, or the center of gravity for our strategy. Regarding the first 2 changes about asymmetric differences, the United States spent over $70 billion, that's with a B, $70 billion on counter-IED, improvised explosive devices. What did the other side spend? Virtually pennies. We're now expending multi-million-dollar weapon systems to destroy Humvees and other equipment that the Islamic State stole from us. And by the way, what is the price of a suicide bomber? Now, compounding these difficulties is that our strategies too often are reactive, they're not responsive, and they focus not on causes but symptoms. And regarding the third change, that is to say the interconnectivity, what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, with Putin, NATO, the EU, what's happening from the Maghreb and the Western Mediterranean all the way to the Bay and Bengal are very much related. And unless we understand these interrelationships and the fact that we have shared and also divided interest and how to accommodate those, we're never going to be able to get it right. Now, the central thing about a brains-based approach goes back to shock and awe, which I and a group of colleagues in the 1990s developed. Interestingly, Don Rumsfeld was part of that group, but Don must have affected some kind of strategic amnesia in 2003. But the focus of shock and awe was to affect, influence, and control will and perception. It had 4 criteria. The first was what we call total knowledge or understanding. That is really gaining insights, which we do very badly. Second was brilliance in operations, that whatever you do had to be done to the highest standard. Third was rapidity, that is to say you had to move much more quickly, anticipating and responding to the adversary. And fourth was controlling the environment, the full spectrum, from electromagnetic to other things. Now, what can the British Army do to implement a brains-based approach? I was very impressed with CGS's remarks today because I think he set a brilliant example of what needs to be done and an agenda. The question is, can you execute? So let me start first that I believe the Army needs institutional, operational, intellectual, academic, and educational action to deal with these issues. Knowing the adversary is obviously something that comes from Sun Tzu. How do we do that better? I will argue that what we need, not just here, but certainly in the West, is a new equivalent of Bletchley Park. As you know, Bletchley Park broke the German codes during World War II. In this particular case, we need to rely much more on the social media and Google Earth to be able to derive fuller understanding. I'll give you an example. A couple of kids, age 20 plus, at the Atlantic Council with which I am affiliated, were able to track, using all the social media, a Russian paratrooper from Siberia to Ukraine. They did it brilliantly. Now, my view is we need to expand this. We need to expand it far more greatly to be able to derive this information. And the best analogy I can give is one of the areas I work is investment banking. We need to be able to do the same level of due diligence that one does in looking at a deal. We don't particularly do that. So the new Bletchley Park, it seems to me, is important. To that end, I would argue that you want to add to your Army's knowledge-based exchange system what the U.S. Army created in Iraq after 2003, which was CompanyCommander.com. For those of you who may not be familiar with this, CompanyCommander.com was a website the Army put together for young officers. You had to be a company commander or junior to exchange relevant, timely information so that when one group came out of Fallujah or Ramadi or wherever, you could dial up and say, gee, do you know about Sheikh X or Street Y? And this was real-time exchange of information. You need to use your knowledge system to expand on that. And given the future generations that are going to be so familiar with social media, I think you will have audiences who are prepared to do that. Next, in terms of staffs, I believe there can be no separation between the G2s, 3s, 5s, 7s. I think we have to take a look at new staffs, and I hope that 77 Brigade and the 1st ISR Brigade are doing that, because the old model is a 20th century model, and quite frankly, it's not going to work in my mind. Third, we need a real revolution in military education. We talk about that, as was referenced before, the so-called strategic corporal is something that has to really drive the way we educate our people from top to bottom. Basically, the system of education is vertical. You go to Stanhurst, you go to West Point, then you go to staff school, then you go to a junior war college, you go to a senior war college, and then you're 75 years old and you retire. That can no longer work. And so therefore, given distance learning, we have to be able to set requirements so that people can get the information that they need in a timely way using all sources, which is not going to be easy. Fourth, and this may be the most controversial, at all levels, Army leaders must be selected in part because of the ability to challenge conventional wisdom and ask the what and why. Now, this has to be handled deftly because I'm challenging good order and discipline. You don't want to say, okay, go over the top and do this, and Sergeant X or Captain Y says, but sir, that's not what I mean. But you have to be able to challenge assumptions. Now, Churchill writes about getting into arguments with General Allenbrook, and Churchill would say, I would growl at Allenbrook and pound the table, and Allenbrook would growl more loudly and pound more hardly than I did. Now, I'm not suggesting mutiny, but I am suggesting that we have to train in our officer and enlisted corps the ability to be able to challenge assumptions. And in that regard, I think the Army needs to establish some kind of red team to challenge the operational, tactical assumptions that go into any sort of policy and strategy. I think this is really, really important. And by the way, I think that this red team challenge needs to be expanded in number 10, something that the political leadership will be very reluctant to do. For example, in the fight against the Islamic State, Daesh, we're assuming that Iraq should be able to do the heavy lifting. But supposing that is wrong, supposing Iraq is not capable of resolving the sectarian divides, what is our plan B? We need to challenge our assumptions. Regarding the political leaders, and this is very controversial, I think in the Army and the Chiefs of Staff and CDS, I may not have the authority to do this. I think you're going to go to outside to former senior officials, members of the House of Lords, to be able to impose upon number 10 war game scenarios, to ask the what-if questions. Supposing, we're talking today about land power, but for example, the one area where Russia, and I agree with Graham Land, I think that Mr. Putin is playing from ultimately a weak hand, the area that they have greatest leverage is in, guess what? Short-range, theater, tactical nuclear weapons, in which they have thousands and we have several. How do you deal with that? And raise those kinds of issues with the political leadership, which quite frankly I hope will scare the shit out of them, because it's the only way that this is going to be done. Now what happens, and this is the most important part of my talk, what happens if these warnings are ignored and actions along the lines I recommend above are not taken, or what CGS wants to do cannot be implemented? Whether we like it or not, absent a crisis or a miscalculation, defense budgets will not go up, and they will be lucky to stay at current levels. And in the United States, when interest rate payments go up, which they will, our budget is going to be hit even greater, and that's going to cause huge contractions. You know the reasons. That means that the British military, like the U.S. military, is at grave risk, let me repeat that, grave risk of becoming a hollow force. As the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Marty Dempsey, said, we are now at the ragged edge in America with a budget that's going to be well in excess of $600 billion. Any cuts here, any reductions, will really exacerbate the fragilities of the British military, and the results are not going to be pleasing. Somebody has got to stand up and warn the political leadership that a hollow force is coming unless people are prepared to accept that or prepared to take action. Now, to mitigate these problems, we need, as Churchill said, we run out of money, we need to think our way through. That's why I believe a brains-based approach is critical. It starts, as I said, with the quest for knowledge and understanding. And even though we give lip service to that, we really have to do a much better job. Secondly, we have to have a mindset for the 21st century that recognizes the differences of a non-Westphalian world in which the empowerment of individuals, groups, and transnational groups are challenging and in some cases superseding the Westphalian system and state-centric politics that we've practiced since 1648. And thirdly, we have to realize that we can exploit these linkages between and among various events in crafting our strategy. The opportunity is very, very real. And I'll give you a final analogy. This year marks the anniversaries of many great events. Magna Carta, I will say Waterloo, I hope there are no French in the audience, but this October, Agincourt. Now, how did Henry V's band of brothers defeat a force that might have been 5 or 10 times longer? They did so with the longbow and a battlefield that became a quagmire in which French heavy armor knights could not move. And so they were routed. In the future, today, we need to find out what is the new longbow equivalent, and how do we make the strategic battlefields of the future quagmires that trap our adversaries and not ourselves? Thank you very much.